They said it could not be done. They said that it was impossible. Oh, how wrong they were. After many travels deep into the dynamite dunes and evergreen gardens, I have finally found the secret. I managed to get 1,000 guests in one queue line. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. I'm sure that almost all of you at some point have built a ride with a really long queue line that eventually filled up with a few hundred guests. This may have left you wondering how far you can push this. Well, I am here to give you the answer. I have known this for a few years, but to keep in line with the intro, we'll pretend that I just discovered this yesterday. You might think that I picked the number 1000 for the title and the intro of this video because it's both a very high number and a nice round number, but 1000 is actually the hard-coded limit. Even if there is plenty of space left, no more guests will join the queue. There are two restrictions at work preventing queue lines from going over 1000. The first is that guests cannot join a queue line that already has 1000 or more guests in it. This restriction alone would be enough, but if the ride is very popular, it could lead to a lot of guests heading for a ride that they cannot go on. To prevent this, there is also a mechanic that prevents guests from heading for a ride that has a full queue line. Now that we know how the limit works, let's get to work to actually get those 1000 guests in one queue line. Back in the day, I used to think that you'd need a huge ride with like 10 excitement or more for this, but you don't. Pretty much any ride can get a queue line of 1000 as long as you know how to exploit the system. In fact, I've even managed to do it with a mini golf that doesn't even have any holes. Before we look at how we can increase the queue length, let's make sure that the queue line is actually long enough. One tile of queue line can hold about 5 guests, and if you have an entirely straight queue line you need 197 tiles to hold 1000 guests. To have a bit of leeway, I'd make the queue line at least 200 tiles long if you're going for this. To increase the length of the queue line we need to solve this inequality. On the left we have the number of guests entering the queue line, and on the right we have the number of guests exiting the queue line. As long as the number on the left is larger than the number on the right, the length will increase. So what we need to do is to get the influx of guests as high as possible while keeping the outflow of guests as low as possible. Let's start with the influx. One thing you can do to increase this is having a lot of guests in your park, as more guests means more potential riders. Another thing you can do to increase this is to get the intensity rating to a number that falls within the preferred intensity range of most guests. For generic parks this is probably between 5 and 7, for parks where guests prefer gentle rides this is under 4, and for parks where guests prefer intense rides this is between 9 and 10. The last thing that you can do to increase the number of guests entering the queue line is having the queue line start at a busy corner of your path network like this. Guests are more likely to walk straight ahead, so when you place your queue line like this, the guests are more likely to enter it. You can see here that the Ferris wheels that have a path opposite their queue line entrance have a much longer queue than the other ones. Reducing the outflow of guests is a tad trickier, as there are multiple ways that the guest can exit the queue line. The first way is a ride closing down for any reason that is not a breakdown, which removes all guests from the queue line. For this video we will assume that the ride does not crash and that we are intelligent enough to not randomly close the ride. The second way a guest can leave the queue is by divine intervention. When God, which is played by us in this game, is bored, he or she may pick up guests and drown them for their entertainment. It is difficult to prevent this as it's extremely fun, but if you manage to keep yourself under control, you can cut this number all the way down to 0. The last two ways are more common, and those are a guest getting on the ride and a guest leaving the queue line because they've waited for too long. You can lower the number of guests getting on the ride by making the ride duration longer, reducing the number of trains and cars per train, and increasing the minimum waiting time. You can also reduce this number to 0 by making sure that the guests are stuck on the ride forever so that no new guests can get on. The last way is actually the most important one, and that is guests getting annoyed because they've waited for too long and leaving the queue line. Unless your ride is very popular and you have an almost constant influx of guests in the queue line, guests will have to wait for a very long time if you want the queue length to reach 1000. There are two ways to reduce this. You can use queue line TVs and you can use entertainers. Queue line TVs increase the time that a guest is willing to wait until they leave, and entertainers reset the time that the guest has already waited, allowing for guests waiting infinitely long as an entertainer is nearby. I have found that some guests will wait forever with just queue line TVs as well, and I'm not exactly sure why. I did see in the code that the number of days a guest has waited for is capped at 255, so maybe the TVs lead to some guests willing to wait for more than 255 days, which leads them to never leaving because that number cannot be reached. Now that we know how all of this works, let's see it in action. First, I want to show you a ride in a real park that I built instead of a setup that I manufactured for this video specifically. This is an extreme heights park that I built on stream about 7 months ago. One of the rides here is an air-powered vertical coaster that, despite having a high throughput of over 2000 guests per hour, has reached the queue length limit. This is because the ride is extremely popular, the park has a lot of guests, and the queue line starts at the corner of the path. Since Extreme Heights has no money, I always hire a bunch of entertainers, which makes sure that the guests don't leave the queue. In my experience, air-powered vertical coasters are extremely good at attracting a lot of guests and as a result generating a very long queue line. Maybe this is just a coincidence, but I suspect that there is something that makes them more popular than most other coasters. Now let's get 1000 guests in the queue line for a very boring ride, like the Crooked House. This is actually rather simple. All we have to do is build the queue line, hire some entertainers or fill it with TVs, and then advertise as much as we can. Now we just have to wait. It will take a while as this ride is not very popular, but because the throughput is quite low and we're generating quite a lot of new guests with our advertising, eventually we'll get to 1000 guests in the queue line. This is of course entirely useless for scenario play, but getting 1000 guests in the queue line for a ride as boring as this is a very good party trick that will bring all the girls and boys to the yard. And that was it for this video. If you liked this video, consider giving it a like or leave a comment. You can also subscribe or follow me on Twitch. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.